A few years ago, my wife Emma and I decided to rent a rustic cottage for our anniversary. We wanted a peaceful getaway, so we chose a charming old house listed on Airbnb. It was a beautiful Victorian-era home filled with antique furniture and rich in history. The host, a man named Richard, had excellent reviews and seemed very welcoming. He greeted us warmly when we arrived, showed us around, and then handed us the keys before leaving us to enjoy our stay. The first night was uneventful. We spent our time exploring the house, reading in the cozy living room, and enjoying the tranquility. But on the second day, things started to get strange. While looking for a book to read, I stumbled upon a hidden latch behind a bookshelf. Curiosity got the better of me, and I pulled it, revealing a narrow passageway. The passage was filled with old, dusty furniture and strange symbols etched into the walls. The air was thick with a musty smell, and the whole place had an eerie vibe. That night, as we lay in bed, we heard a faint noise coming from the passage. At first, we dismissed it as the sounds of an old house settling. But then we heard it again, soft, deliberate footsteps. Nervously, we tried to ignore it, but the sounds continued, growing louder and more distinct. It was clear that someone, or something, was moving around in the hidden passage. Unable to sleep, we decided to confront Richard the next morning. When we explained what we had found and the noises we had heard, Richard's expression darkened. He reluctantly revealed that the passage had once been used by a cult for secret rituals. The symbols on the walls were remnants of their dark practices. Hearing this, Emma and I felt a wave of fear and unease. We knew we couldn't stay another night in the cottage. We cut our trip short and left immediately, not looking back. To this day, I can't forget the eerie experience. The memory of that hidden passage and the unsettling noises haunt me, serving as a chilling reminder that some secrets are best left undiscovered. Sarah and I decided to rent a beach house for a romantic weekend getaway. We found a beautiful place on Airbnb, right by the ocean, perfect for some relaxation and quality time together. When we arrived, the host, a man named Greg, greeted us. At first, he seemed overly friendly, but we didn't think much of it. He showed us around the house, pointed out all the amenities, and then left us to enjoy our stay. The first day was perfect. We spent time on the beach, enjoyed a nice dinner, and relaxed in the cozy living room. But things started to feel off pretty quickly. Greg would show up at the house unannounced, claiming he was just checking to make sure everything was okay. He dropped by multiple times a day, making small talk and lingering longer than necessary. It felt intrusive, but we tried to brush it off. One evening, after a long day of enjoying the sun and surf, Sarah and I were relaxing in the living room. I had just poured us some wine when Sarah suddenly froze, her eyes wide with fear. She pointed to the window, and I turned to see Greg standing outside, staring at us through the glass. My heart pounded in my chest as I quickly closed the curtains. We confronted Greg the next time he showed up, demanding to know why he was watching us. His demeanor changed instantly from friendly to aggressive. He insisted he had every right to check on his property and that we were overreacting. Later that night, when we were trying to sleep, both of us stayed awake on edge. Around midnight, we heard a noise coming from the kitchen. It sounded like someone was moving around downstairs. I got out of bed quietly and grabbed the closest thing I could find for protection, a heavy lamp. I slowly made my way downstairs, my heart racing with every step. When I reached the kitchen, I saw Greg standing there, rummaging through our food. "What the hell are you doing?" I shouted, my voice shaking with a mix of fear and anger. Greg looked up, startled, but quickly tried to play it off. "I was just checking if you had everything you needed," he said, but his eyes had a wild, almost unhinged look. "Get out," I demanded, stepping closer with the lamp raised. "Now." Greg muttered something under his breath, but finally left. Sarah and I locked all the doors and windows, but we knew we couldn't stay there another night. Feeling threatened, we packed our bags and left immediately, cutting our weekend short. We reported Greg to Airbnb, detailing his creepy behavior and how he watched us through the windows. A few weeks later, we received an email from Airbnb. Greg had been arrested for stalking and harassment. Apparently, we weren't his only victims. Other guests had reported similar experiences, And our report was the final piece of evidence the authorities needed to take action. The whole experience was terrifying, and it left us both shaken. What was supposed to be a romantic weekend turned into a nightmare, all because of a creepy host who couldn't respect our privacy. Even now, whenever we book a place to stay, we make sure to read the reviews carefully and choose hosts with a solid track record. It's a chilling reminder that not everyone you meet has good intentions. And sometimes, the scariest part of a trip can be the people you encounter along the way. A few years ago, my wife Samantha and I decided to rent an apartment in an old Victorian house for a weekend getaway. We found it on Airbnb, and the pictures made it look like a charming, quaint place with lots of character. It was just what we needed to escape the hustle and bustle of our everyday lives. When we arrived, the host, a man named Arthur, greeted us warmly. He gave us a quick tour of the apartment, pointing out the antique furniture and the beautiful vintage details. Everything seemed perfect, but there was one thing that caught our attention: a locked door at the end of the hallway. Arthur quickly brushed off our curiosity about the door, saying it was just a storage room and that it was off limits. We didn't think much of it at first and settled in, excited to enjoy our weekend. That evening, after dinner, Samantha and I couldn't help but wonder what was behind the locked door. We joked about it being a secret treasure room or some hidden library. Our curiosity got the better of us, and we decided to take a closer look. I bent down to peek through the keyhole, expecting to see a cluttered storage space. Instead, I saw a dark figure standing motionless in the middle of the room. I quickly pulled back, my heart racing. "Samantha, you have to see this," I whispered. She took her turn at the keyhole and saw the same thing, a dark, shadowy figure that didn't move. The next morning, we asked Arthur about the room again, describing what we had seen. His reaction was strange. He became nervous and avoided our questions, insisting that it was just an old storage room and there was nothing to worry about. His behavior only heightened our unease. That night, as we were getting ready for bed, we heard scratching noises coming from behind the locked door. At first, we thought it might be mice or some other animal, but the sound was too deliberate, too human. We lay in bed, listening to the scratching, feeling a growing sense of dread. Samantha clung to me, and we both knew we couldn't stay there any longer. The noises continued, growing louder and more frantic. First thing in the morning, we packed our bags and left the apartment. We didn't bother saying goodbye to Arthur. We just wanted to get out of there as quickly as possible. A few weeks later, out of curiosity, I did some research on the house. I discovered that the previous owner had died in that very room under mysterious circumstances. The official cause of death was never determined, and there were rumors that his spirit still lingered in the house. The whole experience left us shaken. What was supposed to be a relaxing weekend turned into a terrifying ordeal. Even now, the memory of that dark figure and the scratching noises haunt us. Whenever we rent a place now, we make sure to ask plenty of questions and read all the reviews carefully. It's a chilling reminder that sometimes, the most beautiful places can hide the darkest secrets. It was a quiet Saturday night, and I found myself alone at home. My parents had gone out for dinner, leaving me with the house to myself. The idea of a peaceful evening sounded perfect. I settled into the living room, turned on the TV, and let the glow of the screen fill the room. The house was dark, save for the flickering light from the television, and a cool breeze from the open window brushed against my face. As the hours passed, I got lost in my favorite show, savoring the rare solitude. But as the storyline unfolded, a sudden chill ran down my spine. It was a peculiar sensation, one that I couldn't easily shake off. I tried to dismiss it, blaming the eerie scene on the screen, but the feeling only grew stronger. An inexplicable sense of unease settled over me, and my eyes were involuntarily drawn to the window. Outside, bathed in the dim glow of the streetlight, stood a shadowy figure. My heart skipped a beat, and I squinted, straining to make out the details. The figure remained motionless, seemingly staring directly at me. My pulse quickened, and an icy grip of fear tightened around my chest. Panic surged through me as I grabbed my phone with trembling hands and dialed 911. The operator's calm voice did little to soothe my nerves. I explained what I saw, my voice trembling as I tried to stay composed. They assured me that officers were on their way and advised me to stay inside and lock the doors. I followed their instructions, bolting the front door and turning off the lights, plunging the house into darkness. Every second felt like an eternity as I waited for the police. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the window, where the figure had been standing. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the faint hum of the TV. My mind raced with terrifying scenarios, each more horrifying than the last. Who was this person? What did they want? The questions swirled in my mind, feeding my growing terror. When the flashing lights of the patrol car finally appeared, relief washed over me. The officers arrived quickly, their presence a beacon of safety. But when I pointed to the spot where the figure had stood, it was empty. The officers searched the yard and the surrounding area, their flashlights cutting through the darkness, but they found nothing. No footprints, no evidence that anyone had been there at all. They reassured me, suggesting it might have been a prank or my imagination playing tricks on me. I nodded, but deep down, I knew what I had seen. The figure had been real, and the feeling of being watched had been too intense to dismiss so easily. The officers left, leaving me with their reassurances, but the sense of unease lingered. For weeks, the memory of that night haunted me. Every creak of the house, every shadow cast by the moonlight, sent shivers down my spine. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, especially when I was home alone. It wasn't until the police caught a stalker in our neighborhood that I finally felt some sense of relief. They discovered he had been watching me, and others, for months. Even now, the memory of that night sends shivers down my spine. Trust your instincts. If you feel like you're being watched, you probably are. The shadows may hide more than just darkness. Sometimes, they conceal the silent watcher lurking just out of sight. Another day, another night buried in my textbooks. Pretty normal for me as I'm preparing for my next midterm in a few days. My roommates had gone out for the night, leaving me to my studies. The house was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that makes even the smallest sound echo through the empty rooms. The only illumination came from the lamp on my desk, casting long, eerie shadows that danced across the walls. I was lost in my notes when the phone rang, breaking the silence. The sudden noise startled me, and I glanced at the clock. It was almost midnight. Who would be calling at this hour? I picked up the phone, expecting to hear a familiar voice, but there was only silence on the other end. "Hello," I repeated, but still, no response. The line went dead, leaving an unsettling quiet in its wake. I shrugged it off, thinking it was just a wrong number, and returned to my studies. A few minutes later, the phone rang again. This time, I hesitated before answering, my heart pounding in my chest. When I picked up, a whispering voice on the other end sent chills down my spine. "Emily," it murmured before the line went dead once more. My breath caught in my throat. How did this person know my name? Fear began to creep in, but I tried to stay rational. Maybe it was a prank call, I told myself. I tried to focus on my studies, but my concentration was shattered. Every creak of the house, every rustle of the wind outside seemed amplified, filling the room with a growing sense of dread. The phone rang again. This time I didn't answer. I let it ring, hoping whoever it was would give up. But the ringing continued, persistent and relentless. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I answered the call, my voice trembling. "Who is this? What do you want?" Silence. Then, a low, sinister chuckle. "I'm closer than you think," the voice whispered before hanging up. Panic surged through me. I quickly called the police, my hands shaking as I recounted the calls. They assured me they would trace the number and advised me to stay inside and keep the doors locked. I hung up and locked all the doors and windows, my mind racing with fear and confusion. Minutes felt like hours as I waited for the police. The phone sat ominously silent on the table, a reminder of the terror that had invaded my home. I sat on the couch, hugging my knees to my chest. every nerve on edge. When the police finally arrived, they conducted a thorough search of the house and the surrounding area. After what felt like an eternity, they returned with grim faces. They had traced the calls to a phone line inside the house. My heart dropped. How was that possible? The officers searched the attic and found an old, dusty phone connected to the line. Huddled in a dark corner was a man, his eyes wild and his clothes filthy. He had been living in the attic for weeks, using the phone to terrorize me. The realization that he had been in the house all along, watching me, sent shivers down my spine. The police took him away, but the experience left me deeply shaken. The safety and security of my home had been shattered, replaced by a constant feeling of vulnerability. I couldn't shake the image of the man's eyes, staring at me from the darkness. Even now, years later, the memory of that night haunts me. The creaks and rustles of the house that once brought comfort now fill me with dread. I've become hyper-aware of my surroundings, constantly checking the locks and peering into the shadows. Technology can be our friend, but it can also reveal our deepest fears. Always be cautious, especially when you're alone. Sometimes, the things that go bump in the night are all too real, and the true horror lies in the moments when reality breaks through, revealing the fragility of our sense of safety. It was a typical Friday evening, and I finally had the house to myself. My parents were away for the weekend, enjoying a rare getaway, leaving me to savor the solitude. The house, an old Victorian with creaky floorboards and countless hiding spots, felt both comforting and unnervingly quiet. I decided to spend the night catching up on some reading in my room on the second floor, where I could escape into a different world. The house was dark, save for the soft glow of my bedside lamp and the occasional flicker from the streetlights outside. The night began peacefully enough. I settled into my bed, the weight of the blankets providing a comforting cocoon as I immersed myself in my book. Hours slipped by unnoticed until I heard a soft, almost imperceptible knocking on my bedroom window. At first, I thought it must be the wind, or perhaps a tree branch brushing against the glass. I tried to ignore it, but the knocking persisted, rhythmic and deliberate. I told myself it was nothing, just the house settling or a figment of my imagination. But the sound continued, growing more insistent, as if someone, or something, was trying to get my attention. My curiosity got the better of me, and I set my book aside. As I approached the window, my heart began to pound in my chest, a sense of dread creeping up my spine. Drawing back the curtain, I was met with an unsettling sight. There, staring back at me through the glass, was a face. Pale, gaunt, and expressionless, the figure stood impossibly close to the window. Its eyes were dark voids, and its mouth was a thin, unmoving line. For a moment, I was paralyzed with fear, unable to comprehend how someone could be there, 2 stories up. I stumbled backward, my mind racing with terror. How could this be happening? My hands trembled as I fumbled for my phone and dialed 911. The operator's calm voice did little to soothe my nerves as I explained the situation, my words tumbling out in a frantic rush. They assured me that help was on the way and instructed me to stay inside and lock the doors. I quickly locked my bedroom door and turned off the lights, hoping to make myself less visible. The house was plunged into darkness, and I huddled on the floor, every second stretching into an eternity as I waited for the police. The knocking had stopped, but the silence was even more unsettling, as if the figure was still out there, watching, waiting. When the police finally arrived, their flashing lights casting eerie shadows on the walls, I felt a surge of relief. They searched the yard and the perimeter of the house, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. After what felt like an eternity, they found something that made my blood run cold. A ladder, propped up against the side of the house, leading directly to my window. The officers discovered that the man at my window was a mentally ill relative of a neighbor who had wandered away from home. He had no malicious intent, but the encounter left me deeply shaken. The thought that someone had been so close, watching me, sent shivers down my spine. For weeks after the incident, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every creak of the house, every rustle of leaves outside, would set my heart racing. I became hyper-aware of my surroundings, constantly checking the locks and peering out the windows. Even now, the memory of that night haunts me. Not all scares are supernatural. Real life can be just as terrifying. Always be cautious and trust your instincts. Sometimes the things that go bump in the night are all too real. It was a rare evening that I finally had the house to myself. My mom and dad were away for the weekend, enjoying a rare getaway out of town, leaving me to savor the solitude. The house, built in the 60s with creaky floorboards and countless hiding spots, felt both comforting and unnervingly quiet. I decided to spend the night catching up on some reading in my room on the second floor, where I could escape into a different world. The house was dark, save for the soft glow of my bedside lamp and the occasional flicker from the streetlights outside. The night began peacefully enough. I settled into my bed, the weight of the blankets providing a comforting cocoon as I immersed myself in my book. Hours slipped by unnoticed until I heard a soft, almost imperceptible knocking on my bedroom window. At first, I thought it must be the wind, or perhaps a tree branch brushing against the glass. I tried to ignore it, but the knocking persisted, rhythmic and deliberate. I told myself it was nothing, just the house settling or a figment of my imagination. But the sound continued, growing more insistent, as if someone, or something, was trying to get my attention. My curiosity got the better of me, and I set my book aside. As I approached the window, my heart began to pound in my chest, a sense of dread creeping up my spine. Drawing back the curtain, I was met with an unsettling sight. There, staring back at me through the glass, was a face. Pale, gaunt, and expressionless, the figure stood impossibly close to the window. Its eyes were dark voids, and its mouth was a thin, unmoving line. For a moment, I was paralyzed with fear, unable to comprehend how someone could be there, 2 stories up. I stumbled backward, my mind racing with terror. How could this be happening? My hands trembled as I fumbled for my phone and dialed 911. The operator's calm voice did little to soothe my nerves as I explained the situation, my words tumbling out in a frantic rush. They assured me that help was on the way and instructed me to stay inside and lock the doors. I quickly locked my bedroom door and turned off the lights, hoping to make myself less visible. The house was plunged into darkness, and I huddled on the floor, every second stretching into an eternity as I waited for the police. The knocking had stopped, but the silence was even more unsettling, as if the figure was still out there, watching, waiting. When the police finally arrived, their flashing lights casting eerie shadows on the walls, I felt a surge of relief. They searched the yard and the perimeter of the house, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. After what felt like an eternity, they found something that made my blood run cold. A ladder, propped up against the side of the house, leading directly to my window. The officers discovered that the man at my window was a mentally ill relative of a neighbor who had wandered away from home. He had no malicious intent, but the encounter left me deeply shaken. The thought that someone had been so close, watching me, sent shivers down my spine. For weeks after the incident, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every creak of the house, every rustle of leaves outside, would set my heart racing. I became hyper-aware of my surroundings, constantly checking the locks and peering out the windows. Even now, the memory of that night haunts me. Not all scares are supernatural. Real life can be just as terrifying. Always be cautious and trust your instincts. Sometimes the things that go bump in the night are all too real. It was a cold winter evening, and I was home alone. My roommate had gone out of town for the weekend, leaving me to enjoy the quiet solitude of our apartment. I decided to spend the night catching up on some work, lounging in my favorite chair with my laptop and a cup of hot cocoa. The hours slipped by, the only sound the clicking of my keyboard and the soft hum of the heater. I was lost in my thoughts when my phone buzzed with a new message. I glanced at the screen, expecting it to be a friend, or maybe a spam text. But what I read sent a chill down my spine. "Nice pajamas, Rachel." I looked around the room, trying to shake off the unease. I was wearing my favorite flannel pajamas, the ones I always wore when I wanted to feel cozy. How could someone know what I was wearing? I dismissed it as a prank, some strange coincidence, and tried to focus on my work again. But the messages continued, each one more unsettling than the last. "Enjoying your hot cocoa?" read the next message, followed by, "That chair looks comfortable." My heart began to race, my mind struggling to make sense of what was happening. Someone was watching me, and they knew every detail of what I was doing. I checked the locks on the doors and windows, making sure everything was secure. The thought of someone watching me, knowing my every move, was terrifying. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself it was just a cruel joke, but the fear was too real. The next message made my blood run cold. "I miss seeing you like this, Rachel." I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. There was only one person who could have sent that message, my ex-boyfriend, Tom. We had broken up months ago, but he had always been possessive, never quite willing to let go. I dialed 911, my hands shaking as I explained the situation to the operator. They assured me that officers were on their way and told me to stay on the line. As I waited, I received one final message. "You can't hide from me." The police arrived quickly, their presence bringing a sense of relief. They searched the apartment, and what they found confirmed my worst fears. Hidden in the corners of the living room and bedroom were tiny cameras, carefully placed to capture every moment of my life. Tom had been watching me, invading my privacy in the most horrifying way. The officers traced the cameras back to Tom, and he was arrested for stalking and harassment. The realization that he had been watching me, controlling me from afar, left me feeling violated and deeply unsettled. The safety and comfort of my home had been shattered, replaced by a constant sense of vulnerability. In the weeks that followed, I took steps to regain control of my life. I changed the locks, installed a security system, and made sure to be more cautious about who I let into my life. The experience left me hyper-vigilant, always looking over my shoulder, but it also taught me an important lesson about trust and boundaries. The memory of those messages, the feeling of being watched, still haunts me. Every time I see my phone light up with a new message, a part of me tenses, afraid of what it might say. The comfort and familiarity of my home have been tainted by the knowledge that someone I once trusted had turned it into a prison. Always be cautious about who you let into your life. Sometimes, the people we think we know best are the ones who can hurt us the most. Trust your instincts, protect your privacy, and never underestimate the lengths someone might go to in order to maintain control. The true horror lies in the moments when the people we let in become the monsters we fear. The idea of a weekend getaway to the mountains was supposed to be a refreshing escape from our busy lives. My girlfriend Emma and I had planned everything meticulously. The route was mapped out, the cabin booked, and the car packed with supplies. We were excited about the adventure that awaited us. A few days of hiking, stargazing, and disconnecting from the world. Little did we know, this trip would turn into a harrowing ordeal that we would never forget. We set off early on a crisp Friday morning, the sun just beginning to rise. The drive was picturesque, the scenery shifting from urban sprawl to rolling hills and dense forests. By late afternoon, we were deep into the mountains, following the GPS's instructions to our secluded cabin. "Take the next left," the GPS instructed. I glanced at Emma, who nodded, confirming it was the right turn. The road we turned onto was narrow and winding, bordered by thick trees that seemed to close in around us. "Are you sure this is the right way?" I asked, a hint of doubt creeping into my voice. "Yeah, the map shows it's a shortcut," Emma replied, though she seemed less certain now. We continued down the road, which grew rougher and more overgrown. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the path. Our sense of excitement slowly gave way to unease. The road seemed to stretch on endlessly, and there was no sign of the cabin or any other human presence. "This doesn't feel right," I muttered, glancing at the GPS. It had lost signal, the screen showing only a spinning icon. I pulled out my phone, no service. "Let's turn back," Emma suggested, her voice tinged with worry. I agreed and found a spot to turn the car around. But as we retraced our steps, the road seemed different. The familiar landmarks we had passed were nowhere to be seen. The path split into multiple directions, none of which looked familiar. Panic set in. "What the hell is going on?" I exclaimed, frustration bubbling over. Emma tried to stay calm. "Maybe we missed the turn. Let's keep going a bit further." We drove on, but the road only grew more confusing. It twisted and turned, looping back on itself in ways that defied logic. The dense forest seemed to swallow us whole, and the daylight was fading fast. "Stop the car," Emma said suddenly. "We need to figure out where we are." I pulled over, and we both got out, looking around. The silence was deafening, the air thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. The towering trees loomed above us, their branches intertwining like a canopy. "We're lost," Emma said, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, trying to keep my own fear in check. "Let's try to get some elevation. Maybe we can see a way out." We grabbed our backpacks and set off into the forest, hoping to find higher ground. The underbrush was thick and tangled, making progress slow and difficult. As we climbed, the sky grew darker, the forest plunging into shadows. After what felt like hours, we reached a rocky outcrop. From there, we could see the vast expanse of the forest stretching out in all directions. There was no sign of the road or any hint of civilization, just endless trees and darkness creeping in. "We're really in the middle of nowhere," Emma said, her voice trembling. I wrapped my arm around her, trying to offer some comfort. "We'll find a way out. We just need to stay calm and stick together." We decided to head back to the car and spend the night there. As we made our way down, the forest seemed even more foreboding. Strange noises echoed through the trees, the rustle of leaves, the snap of branches, and distant, unidentifiable sounds that sent chills down my spine. When we finally reached the car, it was almost completely dark. We climbed inside, locking the doors and trying to settle in for the night. The sense of isolation was overwhelming. The darkness outside the windows was impenetrable, and the forest seemed to press in on us. "We'll head out at first light," I said, trying to sound reassuring. Emma nodded, but I could see the fear in her eyes. We huddled together, trying to find some comfort in each other's presence. The night was long and terrifying. Every little sound outside the car made us jump. The wind howled through the trees, and at times it sounded like voices whispering just beyond the darkness. As dawn broke, we were exhausted but determined to find a way out. We ate a quick breakfast from our supplies and set off again. The forest seemed different in the daylight, but the sense of disorientation remained. Hours turned into a blur as we wandered through the woods, trying to find any sign of the road. Our sense of direction was completely gone, and the deeper we went, the more lost we felt. The forest was a maze, and we were trapped within its endless green walls. "Look!" Emma suddenly pointed. Ahead of us was a small clearing with what looked like a worn path. Hope surged within us as we followed it, praying it would lead us to safety. But as we walked, the path twisted and turned, leading us deeper into the unknown. The trees seemed to close in around us, their branches like skeletal fingers reaching out. The air grew colder, and an eerie silence settled over the forest. "We need to go back," Emma said, her voice filled with dread. I agreed, but as we turned to retrace our steps, the path had vanished. It was as if the forest itself was conspiring against us, shifting and changing to keep us trapped. Panic set in. We wandered in circles, calling out for help, but our voices were swallowed by the trees. The sun began to set once again, and we realized we were in serious trouble. Exhausted and scared, we found a spot to rest for the night. We built a small fire, hoping the light would offer some comfort and protection. The flickering flames cast eerie shadows, and every rustle in the darkness sent shivers down my spine. "We're going to get out of here," I said, more to convince myself than Emma. She nodded, clutching my hand tightly. "We have to." That night was the longest of my life. The forest seemed alive with unseen eyes watching us, and the sounds of the night were filled with menace. We took turns keeping watch, but exhaustion eventually overcame us both. When dawn finally broke, we were determined to make one last push to find our way out. We gathered our things and set off, driven by sheer willpower and the hope of survival. Hours later, just as we were about to lose hope, we stumbled upon an old dirt road. Relief flooded through us as we followed it, praying it would lead us to civilization. After what felt like an eternity, we saw a car approaching in the distance. We waved frantically, and it slowed to a stop. The driver, a kind old man, offered us water and a ride to the nearest town. As we climbed into the car, I glanced back at the forest. It looked calm and peaceful in the daylight, belying the terror it had held for us. We thanked the man profusely and sank into the seats, utterly exhausted but grateful to be alive. The ordeal had changed us. We never spoke of the details of those terrifying nights again, but the experience left a lasting mark on our souls. We had faced the darkness together and come out the other side, stronger and more connected than ever. To this day, the memory of being lost in the wilderness haunts me. The forest, with its shifting paths and eerie silence, remains a place of nightmares. But we survived, and that is something I will always hold on to. It was supposed to be a simple road trip, a chance for me and my girlfriend Emma to escape the city and reconnect. We planned a weekend getaway to a quaint little town known for its scenic overlooks and serene landscapes. Everything was perfect, or so we thought. We left early in the morning, excited about the adventure ahead. The drive was smooth, the weather perfect, and the countryside beautiful. By late afternoon, we had covered most of the distance and decided to take a detour to a well-known scenic overlook. It was a spot often praised by travelers for its breathtaking views of the valley below. We arrived just as the sun was beginning to set, casting a golden hue over the landscape. The overlook was deserted, adding to the tranquility of the place. We parked the car and walked to the edge, taking in the stunning view. It was everything we had hoped for. After a while, we settled down on a blanket with some snacks, enjoying the peaceful silence. As the sky darkened, the stars began to appear, one by one, twinkling above us. It felt magical, like we were the only two people in the world. Suddenly, our serene moment was shattered by a faint, distant scream. We both froze, trying to determine if we had really heard it. "Did you hear that?" Emma asked, her voice shaky. I nodded, straining my ears for any further sounds. Another scream echoed through the valley, louder this time. It sounded like it was coming from the forest below the overlook. My heart pounded in my chest. "We should check it out. Someone might be in trouble," Emma suggested, concern etched on her face. Reluctantly, I agreed. We grabbed a flashlight from the car and made our way down a narrow path that led into the woods. The further we went, the darker it became, the canopy of trees blocking out the moonlight. The screams grew more frequent, each one sending chills down my spine. "Maybe we should call the police," I suggested, pulling out my phone. But there was no signal, typical in such remote areas. We pressed on, the beam of our flashlight cutting through the darkness. The forest was eerily quiet, except for the occasional rustle of leaves and the haunting screams. We finally reached a clearing where the sound seemed to be coming from. But to our confusion, there was no one there. "Hello, is anyone there?" Emma called out, her voice trembling. There was no response, just the oppressive silence. Suddenly, a cold breeze swept through the clearing, and the flashlight flickered. We both jumped, our nerves on edge. "We should go back," Emma whispered, fear evident in her eyes. I agreed. We turned to leave when we heard another scream, this time much closer and more desperate. It sounded like a woman in distress. Torn between fear and the need to help, we decided to follow the sound a little further. The path led us deeper into the forest. The screams became more erratic, as if the person was moving quickly or being chased. Every step we took felt like a step further into a nightmare. Finally, we reached an old, abandoned cabin. The door was ajar, and the screams seemed to be coming from inside. I hesitated at the threshold, my heart racing. "Maybe we should wait for help," I suggested, knowing we had no means to call for it. "We can't just leave her," Emma insisted, her determination overcoming her fear. Taking a deep breath, I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The cabin was dark and musty, with broken furniture strewn about. The screams had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. We cautiously explored the cabin, our flashlight revealing nothing but dust and decay. "There's no one here," I said, relieved and confused. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind us, plunging us into darkness. The flashlight flickered and went out, leaving us in pitch black. Emma screamed, and I fumbled with the flashlight, finally getting it to work again. When the beam cut through the darkness, we saw something that made our blood run cold. In the corner of the room stood a figure, its features obscured by shadows. It was tall and thin, with long matted hair. It stared at us with hollow eyes, not moving, just watching. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice shaking. The figure remained silent, then let out a blood-curdling scream. It was the same scream we had been hearing all along. Terrified, we backed away, but the figure advanced slowly. Without thinking, I grabbed Emma's hand and bolted for the door. We ran through the forest, not daring to look back. We finally reached the car, breathless and terrified. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking, and managed to start the engine. We sped away, the screams still echoing in our ears. We didn't stop until we reached the town, where we found a small police station. Breathless and still in shock, we told the officers what had happened. They exchanged skeptical glances but agreed to check it out. The next morning, they informed us that they had found the cabin, but there was no sign of anyone there. "That area has a dark history," one of the officers said. "Years ago, a woman disappeared near that overlook. Some say her spirit haunts the place, seeking help that never comes." We left the town as quickly as we could, the experience leaving a deep scar on our souls. To this day, the memory of those distant screams haunts us. We never spoke of that night again, but every time we hear a scream, even in the distance, we're reminded of the horrors that lurk just beyond the edge of the known world. I've always enjoyed road trips, the thrill of the open road, the sense of freedom, the endless possibilities lying just beyond the horizon. One summer, my friends and I decided to explore the countryside, seeking out hidden gems and quaint little towns off the beaten path. Little did we know, we were about to stumble upon a mystery that would haunt us forever. We were deep into our journey, the sun beginning its descent, casting long shadows across the winding roads. Our GPS had taken us through a series of small villages and scenic routes, and we were loving every moment of it. But as twilight approached, we decided it was time to find a place to stay for the night. "Hey, there's a turn coming up. Should we take it?" "Might be a shortcut," suggested Mike, the navigator for our trip. I glanced at the road ahead. It was a narrow, barely noticeable path veering off to the left, flanked by dense woods. There was no signpost, no indication of where it might lead. But, feeling adventurous, I nodded. "Sure, let's give it a shot. What's the worst that could happen?" As we turned onto the narrow road, an eerie silence seemed to envelop the car. The dense forest closed in around us, the trees towering high above, blocking out the fading light. The road was rough and overgrown, clearly seldom used, but we pressed on, hoping to find a shortcut or perhaps a hidden gem. Minutes turned into an hour, and the road seemed to stretch endlessly before us. The sense of unease grew stronger with each passing mile. Our laughter and chatter gradually died down, replaced by a tense silence. "Are you sure this is the right way?" Sarah asked from the back seat, her voice tinged with worry. Mike glanced at the GPS, frowning. "It says we should be close to the main road, but it doesn't look like we're getting anywhere." Frustration mounting, I kept driving, hoping to find a clearing or a sign of civilization. But the road seemed determined to lead us deeper into the unknown. The forest grew denser, the shadows darker. The sense of being watched crept over us, an oppressive weight settling on our shoulders. Suddenly, the headlights caught a glimpse of something ahead, a figure standing by the side of the road. I slowed down, peering through the windshield. It was an old man, his face obscured by the shadows. He raised a hand, signaling us to stop. "Should we?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah, maybe he can give us directions," Mike replied. though he didn't sound convinced. I rolled down the window, the cool night air rushing in. "Excuse me, sir. We're a bit lost. Can you tell us where this road leads?" The old man stepped closer, his face coming into view. His eyes were wild, darting around erratically, and his clothes were tattered and dirty. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. "Turn back," he said, his voice shaky and urgent. "This road is not meant for you." Chills ran down my spine. "But we just need to get to the main road. Can you help us?" "Turn back," he repeated, more forcefully this time, his hands trembling. "Before it's too late. They don't like visitors." Before we could ask anything else, he stepped back into the shadows and disappeared. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. Something about his warning felt all too real. "Let's get out of here," Sarah urged, her voice trembling. I nodded, ready to reverse the car. But as I glanced in the rearview mirror, my heart sank. The road behind us had vanished, replaced by an impenetrable wall of trees. "Mike, check the GPS again," I said, panic rising. Mike fiddled with the device, but the screen was blank. "It's not working. We're completely off the grid." Desperation set in. We were trapped on a road that seemed to have a mind of its own, leading us further into a labyrinth of darkness. I kept driving, hoping to find a way out, but the road continued to twist and turn, mocking our efforts. Hours passed, and exhaustion began to take its toll. The forest remained silent, no signs of wildlife or human presence. Just when we thought all hope was lost, we saw a faint light in the distance, a glimmer of hope. "Look! A light! Maybe it's a house or a car," Sarah exclaimed. We drove towards the light, hearts pounding with anticipation. But as we drew closer, the light seemed to move, leading us further into the forest. It was as if it was guiding us, but to where? Finally, we reached a clearing. In the center stood an old, dilapidated cabin, the source of the mysterious light. Reluctantly, we got out of the car, the sense of dread overwhelming. The cabin door creaked open, and the old man stumbled out. His movements were jittery, his eyes bloodshot and unfocused. He looked like he was on something, or perhaps suffering from severe withdrawal. You didn't listen," he mumbled, shaking his head erratically. "They told me to warn you. Please, help us. We just want to get out of here," I pleaded. The old man's eyes darted around, as if he was seeing things we couldn't. "This road, it doesn't exist in your world. It's a place between places, a trap for the lost." "Then how do we leave?" Mike asked, desperation in his voice. "Follow the light," the old man replied, pointing to a lantern hanging by the cabin door. "It will guide you back. But you must promise never to return. They don't like visitors." We nodded fervently, taking the lantern. As we walked back to the car, the light began to flicker, casting long shadows on the ground. We drove in silence, the lantern guiding us through the winding, endless road. Hours later, the forest began to thin, and we found ourselves back on a familiar highway. Relief washed over us as the first rays of dawn broke through the trees. We never spoke of that night again. The memory of the disappearing road, the erratic old man, and the eerie light haunted us. But one thing was certain: we would never stray from the beaten path again. To this day, I wonder about that road. Was it a figment of our imagination, a shared hallucination, or something far more sinister? Whatever it was, it left an indelible mark on our souls, a reminder of the unknown lurking just beyond the edge of reality. I've always been drawn to abandoned places. There's a haunting beauty in decay, a whisper of stories left untold. So when I heard about the old carnival on the edge of town, I couldn't resist. It had been closed for years, ever since that tragic accident on the Ferris wheel. People said it was haunted, but I didn't believe in ghosts. I just wanted to capture its eerie splendor with my camera. The entrance to the carnival was overgrown with weeds, the gate rusted and hanging ajar. I parked my car nearby and walked through the broken gate, past a faded sign that read, "Welcome to Funtown Carnival." The rides were rusted, the tents torn, and the paths were overtaken by nature. As I stepped through the gates, the carnival felt more like a graveyard than a place of joy. The eerie silence was occasionally broken by the creak of metal or the rustle of leaves. I walked down the midway, taking pictures. I stopped at an old carousel, its horses frozen in mid-gallop, their eyes dull and lifeless. They looked like they were waiting for something, or someone, to bring them back to life. I captured a few shots, trying to imagine the laughter and music that once filled the air. As I ventured further in, I noticed signs of recent activity. Footprints in the dirt, cigarette butts, and empty beer cans. It was unsettling, but not entirely surprising. Teenagers and homeless people often sought refuge in such places. Still, I kept my guard up, just in case. I reached the center of the carnival, where the big top tent loomed ominously. Its once bright stripes were now faded and grimy. I hesitated for a moment before pulling back the heavy flap and stepping inside. The smell hit me immediately, a rancid mix of sweat, urine, and something else I couldn't identify. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing rows of dilapidated seats and a stage covered in debris. As I moved deeper into the tent, I heard a faint rustling sound. My heart pounded in my chest, but curiosity got the better of me. That's when I saw them, clowns. At least a dozen of them scattered around the tent. Their once vibrant costumes were now tattered and filthy, their makeup smeared and grotesque. They moved with a jittery, unsettling energy, and I realized with horror that they were high, probably on whatever drugs they could get their hands on. I tried to back away slowly, but one of them spotted me. His eyes were wild, and he let out a guttural scream that sent shivers down my spine. The others turned to look, their expressions a mix of rage and madness. I knew I had to get out of there, fast. I spun around and ran, but the clowns were on me in an instant. One grabbed my arm, his grip surprisingly strong. I swung my flashlight at him, connecting with his head and sending him sprawling. Another lunged at me, and I kicked out, catching him in the stomach. Panic surged through me as I fought to break free. I managed to slip past them and bolted for the exit. I could hear their footsteps pounding behind me, their deranged laughter echoing in the night. My breath came in ragged gasps, and my legs felt like they were on fire, but I couldn't stop. I wouldn't stop. I burst out of the tent and sprinted toward my car. The clowns were still chasing me, their faces twisted with fury and madness. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking uncontrollably. Finally, I managed to unlock the door and threw myself inside, slamming it shut just as the first clown reached me. I started the engine and tore out of there, the tires screeching on the pavement. In the rearview mirror, I saw the clowns standing at the edge of the carnival, watching me with hollow eyes. I didn't stop driving until I was safely back in my apartment, my heart still racing from the encounter. I never went back to that carnival. The memory of those crazed clowns haunted me for weeks, their faces appearing in my nightmares. The thrill of exploring abandoned places had lost its appeal, replaced by a chilling reminder of the dangers that lurked in the shadows. The following days were a blur of restless nights and anxious days. Every creak of my apartment building, every shadow that moved, set my nerves on edge. I couldn't shake the image of those clowns, their wild eyes, their grotesque faces. I had always prided myself on being fearless, but this experience had shaken me to my core. About a week after the incident, I decided to go for a walk to clear my head. The city's bustle was a stark contrast to the eerie silence of the abandoned carnival. As I walked through the crowded streets, I began to feel a little more at ease. The rational part of my mind reassured me that the clowns couldn't have followed me, that I was safe. Just as I started to relax, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Across the street, standing by a bus stop, was a clown. Not just any clown. One of the clowns from the carnival. His makeup was still smeared, his clothes still tattered. Our eyes met, and a sickening grin spread across his face. I quickly turned away, my heart pounding in my chest. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, that the encounter at the carnival had left me paranoid. But as I continued to walk, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Over the next few days, I kept seeing them. In the grocery store, at the park, even outside my apartment building. They were always just far enough away that I couldn't be sure if they were real or not. I started to feel like I was losing my mind. One night, I woke up to the sound of shuffling outside my apartment door. My heart raced as I grabbed my flashlight and cautiously approached the door. The peephole revealed nothing but darkness. I took a deep breath and slowly opened the door, my flashlight beam cutting through the dim hallway. There, standing in the hallway, were 3 clowns. Their eyes gleamed with a malevolent light, and their twisted smiles sent a chill down my spine. Before I could react, they lunged at me. I fought with everything I had, swinging my flashlight and kicking out. But they were relentless. One of them grabbed my arm, another my leg. I managed to break free and slammed the door shut, locking it behind me. My heart pounded in my ears as I leaned against the door, gasping for breath. I knew I couldn't stay there. I quickly packed a bag and climbed out of my bedroom window, escaping into the night. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I had to get as far away as possible. For weeks, I stayed on the move, never staying in one place for too long. The clowns seemed to be everywhere, always just a step behind me. I couldn't understand how they kept finding me, but I knew I had to stay ahead of them. Eventually, I made my way to a small, quiet town far from the city. I found a cheap motel and checked in under a fake name. I hoped that I had finally lost them, that I could start to rebuild my life. But the nightmares continued. Every night, I dreamed of the carnival, of the clowns chasing me through the dark, decaying grounds. I would wake up in a cold sweat, my heart racing, and it would take hours to calm down enough to fall back asleep. One evening, as I sat in my motel room, I heard a knock at the door. My heart skipped a beat. I cautiously approached the door and looked through the peephole. To my relief, it was just the motel manager. I opened the door, and he handed me a package. "This came for you," he said, his expression neutral. I thanked him and closed the door, my hands shaking as I opened the package. Inside was a small, battered box. I hesitated before opening it, my gut telling me that something was very wrong. But curiosity got the better of me, and I lifted the lid. Inside was a single red clown nose. I dropped the box, my heart pounding in my chest. They had found me. I didn't know how, but they had found me. That night, I didn't sleep. I packed my things and left the motel, driving through the night to a new town, a new motel. But no matter how far I ran, I couldn't escape the feeling that they were always just a step behind me. I've stopped trying to understand why they haunt me. Maybe it's their twisted sense of revenge, or maybe they're just drawn to the fear they know they can elicit. All I know is that the clowns from the abandoned carnival will never stop hunting me, and I will never stop running.